the late 15th century. Constantinople, the ancient capital of Eastern Rome, lies at the center of one of history's ultimate power struggles. The Ottoman Turks, with their growing Euro-Asian empire, emerge as a military juggernaut that threatens to sweep across the Christian kingdoms of Europe. Serbia, Albania, Romania, Hungary, and the dying remnant of the old Byzantine Empire stand in the path of unrelenting Ottoman conquest. Is there any force powerful enough to halt the Ottoman colossus? Amid this desperate atmosphere, a crusading brotherhood emerges. The Order of the Dragon, who swear to do battle against the enemies of the cross. The dragon for them is the Ottoman Sultan, and they vow to slay it. But can they? From Hungary, a champion emerges, John Hunyadi, a warrior captain who inspires the fire of resistance. Raising the banner of crusade, Hunyadi leads coalition armies from the small Christian states against the Ottoman legions. His valor and skill will take the battle to the very heart of Ottoman power. But can Hunyadi and his allies reverse the situation? What of Constantinople? When Mehmed, the ambitious, cunning young sultan, sets his sights on the old imperial capital, can any force in Christendom stop him? Whatever the case, Constantine XI, the emperor who rules the tiny remnant of Byzantium, will rally the defense and will refuse to put down his sword as the Ottomans attack. Today on Real Crusades History, we'll follow the incredible history of the Ottoman Empire, the crusaders who stood against it, and the final agony of the capital of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople. Join us. Vlad the Impaler, the man who gave rise to the myth of Dracula, was born in 1431, the year that Joan of Arc was burned as a witch by the English. Baby Vlad was born to the military governor of Transylvania, Vlad Dracul, in the foreboding frontier fortress of Sighișoara. The baby was named Vlad for his father. He was the second oldest of Dracul's sons. The elder, called Mircea, was his father's heir, and the third, who would be born 4 years after Vlad, would be the handsomest of the brothers, Radu. Only a year later, in 1432, another child was born, but in far more lavish circumstances. This baby was the third male child of the Ottoman Sultan, Murad II, born on March 30th in a fantastically opulent island pleasure palace at Thrace. The baby's name was Mehmed, and his mother was only one of hundreds of girl slaves that, according to Ottoman law, was the property of the Sultan. She was Greek, a Christian, and had only briefly held the attention of the supreme ruler Murad. By giving the Sultan a son, her status was raised slightly, and she now received her own apartments and staff of slaves. Mehmed's mother doted on him, while his father ignored him. Probably both could not imagine the impact this boy would one day impose on the world. Vlad, son of Vlad Dracul of Wallachia, was born on the very edge of what historians Radu Flores and Raymond McNally call a single civilization, connected by solid dynastic and cultural ties. That single civilization was European Christendom, which stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Black Sea and the Baltic coast. At the moment of Vlad's birth, it was a civilization at war, and its great enemy was very much on the rise. The Ottoman Turks, who first crossed the Dardanelles Straits, which separate Europe from Asia, in 1353. From then on, the power of the Ottomans would grow and pose an ever greater danger to the Christian territories of Europe. They began to subdue Serbia, Bulgaria, and Albania, threatening the whole of the Balkan peninsula. By the early 15th century, the Ottomans had brought their rule to the Danube, the frontier of what would ultimately be Vlad Dracula's domain, which was also at that time the frontier of Christendom. Beyond that, Christians lived as subjects to the powerful Ottoman Sultan. Thus, The world of young Vlad was a world of Christian resistance against Ottoman expansion, a world of the crusade against the Turks. It was a battle most unbalanced. Small European Christian states struggled to maintain their independence before an enormous Ottoman juggernaut, which seemed destined to swallow up the whole of the world. At the top of this ever-growing Ottoman imperium was the Sultan, a figure comparable to the ancient emperors of Persia. Owner of countless slaves, the Ottoman Sultan lounged in vast opulent palaces and pleasure gardens while his numberless armies taught the world to tremble. His word was law, and his whim meant life or death. Against this ferocious imperial menace, the small kingdoms and counties of central Christian Europe mounted what resistance they could, and the totem of their resistance was the cross. Christians living under Ottoman rule were, as Flores and McNally put it, reduced to second-class status under the domination of an alien creed. But perhaps the most painful of the Christian sufferings was the system of Ottoman conscription, in which the Sultan required a certain number of boy children to be handed over from the Christian communities of the Balkans. These Christian boys were selected by the Ottoman authorities themselves for their beauty and strength, stolen from their families, and raised as slaves in a fanatical ideology of loyalty to the Ottoman Sultan. This army of slaves was known as the Janissary Corps. The Christians of the Balkans particularly reviled this system as a distinctly evil barbarism of the Ottomans. It was one thing to subjugate the Christians of the Balkans, but to tear children from the arms of their mothers and raise them in a nightmarish cult of fanatical violence, brainwashing them into soldiers against their own people. This stands out as one of history's most unsettling and repulsive practices. Across Christian Europe, the concept of the Balkan Crusade was understood and championed as the heroic effort of the peoples on the edge of the Ottoman Empire to resist under the banner of the cross. The Pope in Rome equated this struggle with Spain's battle against the Moors, as well as the Holy Land Crusades of earlier centuries. A constant reminder of the stakes of this epic struggle was the sad remnant of the Byzantine Empire, still clinging to its capital of Constantinople. Centuries ago, Byzantium had been the greatest power in Christendom, but by the early 1400s, it was reduced to Constantinople itself, and a few scattered territories across Asia Minor, Greece, and the Balkans, trembling under the threatening shadow of the Ottoman colossus. It's understandable that rulers with frontiers closer to the Ottoman Empire were most concerned about its expansion, but a common sentiment across Christendom was that the rulers of the West had neglected their Christian duty to fight the Sultan's armies. In truth, the kingdoms of England and France, once ruled by dedicated crusaders, had scarcely lifted a hand against the Ottomans, nor had Italian powers such as Venice or Genoa prioritized the wider defense of Christendom. Even the largely German Holy Roman Empire, which, due to its centrality in Europe, was more directly threatened by the Ottomans, had as yet involved itself little in the Ottoman Crusade. Beyond the eastern frontier of the Holy Roman Empire lay the elective monarchies of Poland, Lithuania, and Hungary. Hungary by this period had dynastic ties to the Holy Roman Empire, and by its location would become a primary player in the struggle with the Ottomans. Farther southeast, the Catholic world gave way to Orthodox territories. The principalities and kingdoms of Wallachia, Moldova, Serbia, and Bulgaria, either directly confronting or already half or fully swallowed up by Ottoman power. It was here, on the very frontier of Christendom, where the great battle would unfold in the 15th century, and where Vlad Dracula and Mehmed the Conqueror would clash. And yet, even in the small states directly bordering the Ottoman Empire, petty feuds and political jockeying of the nobles often distracted from the existential threat of the Turks. Wallachia, the land of Vlad's ancestors, lay in the direct path of the Ottoman juggernaut. Its princes naturally cultivated bonds with the Hungarians, and with the Holy Roman Empire. Vlad's own father was raised at the court of the Holy Roman Empire, where he received the education of the imperial princes. It was in these circles that Vlad would be inducted into the very elite crusading Order of the Dragon, a circle of knights sworn to battle the Turks for the defense of Christendom.
Hey everybody, I'd like to take a quick break to thank today's video sponsor, Raycon, who makes something that I love, the Everyday Earbuds Classic by Raycon. You guys know me, I'm a history addict, and when I'm out for a run, I like to listen to audiobooks, podcasts, anything like that to help me with my research. I also enjoy a good lecture series, like Tom Madden's series on the Crusades, so my Raycon earbuds are with me every step of the way. Now is the perfect time to get some Raycons because they've brought back their fan favorite classic model, now packed in noise cancellation. Raycon's noise cancellation feature is awesome. The sound is crystal clear and consistent. I don't miss a minute of historical detail no matter where I go. The optimized gel fit makes them incredibly comfortable to wear. Plus, the power is great. You get 8 hours of playtime and a 32-hour battery life. You guys also know me. I'm a musician and I love quality audio. Raycon delivers, and at half the price of the big audio brands. I am very grateful to Raycon for their support of Real Crusades history. So if you're looking to get a great set of earbuds and help out my channel, go to buyraycon.com/realcrusades for 20% off and free shipping on their Everyday Earbuds Classic. Thanks for your attention, guys. Let's get back to our topic.
In 1431, Vlad of Wallachia, father of Vlad the Impaler, was summoned to Nuremberg by Sigismund, King of Germany, Bohemia, Hungary, and Croatia, and soon to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor. Along with other high-ranking nobles, Vlad stood in the double chapel of the imperial fortress in the dawn chill of February 8th. There, Vlad and these other men were inducted into an elite circle of knights, the Order of the Dragon. The order had been founded by Sigismund as an elite brotherhood to defend the German king and his family, to protect the empire, to guard over widows and orphans, but above all, to act as God's sword against the enemies of Christendom, identified as the Turks, and heretics such as Jan Hus. Only 24 men were selected for this first elite circle. Vlad was among them. This princely son of Wallachia was to stand alongside the Holy Roman Emperor and be as an archangel in the army of God. The order featured rich symbolism. Each knight received 2 capes, one green, the dragon's hue, to be worn over a red garment signifying the martyr's blood. The other cape was black, later adopted by Bram Stoker for his vampire character, to be worn only on Fridays or during the season of Christ's Passion, as a reminder of Christ's ultimate sacrifice for man. Each member received a gold medallion, which depicted the cross conquering the dragon, a symbol of Christ's victory over darkness. For it was the object of the order to slay the great dragons that threatened God's church and people. The medallion was inscribed with the Latin phrases, O quam misericors est Deus, Oh, how faithful is God, and Justus et Pius, just and faithful. Each member was to wear this medallion until his death, at which point it would be buried with him. We understand the prestige of Vlad's induction when we examine the other members of Sigismund's brotherhood, Alfonso V of Aragon, Stefan Lazarevich of Serbia, Witold of Lithuania, and Ladislas of Poland. When he returned to the land of his fathers, Vlad was known as Vlad Dracul, due to his membership in the Order of the Dragon. On the same day as his induction, Vlad swore allegiance to the Holy Roman Emperor. Sigismund declared him Prince of Wallachia, and Vlad swore to protect the Catholic faith in Wallachia, which was an Orthodox country. The occasion was celebrated with a feast and a tournament, at which Vlad distinguished himself as a capable knight. Wielding his lance with grace and power, Vlad unhorsed a particularly formidable opponent. One of the imperial ladies was so impressed that she threw at the feet of the Romanian champion a beautiful golden buckle. For centuries, scholars wondered if this story were true or only a fanciful invention, until at last, in 1931, the tomb of Dracul's son was opened. There was found a golden buckle exactly as described in the original sources, inscribed with the name of a Nuremberg craftsman known to have worked in the 1430s. At his father's court, young Vlad III learned the arts of the warrior elite, an education not unlike the strict training of the Spartans of old. Noble children were exposed to cold on stormy days. If they survived the resulting fevers and chills, they were deemed fit as the sons of warriors. Even as a 5-year-old, Vlad learned to handle horses. He had to mount and ride his steed bareback, and was instructed to ride at a gallop to the local fountain or grazing field and back to his father's fortress. Swimming, fencing, jousting and archery were daily activities, as were lessons in court etiquette, diplomacy and the subtleties of law. As he grew older, Vlad's lessons were refined, and he learned from increasingly more masterful members of his father's entourage, such as one elderly knight who'd fought the Turks at the Battle of Nicopolis. Vlad's education was not confined to the skills of the nobles. At the local monasteries, he was trained in the literary arts. The monks taught him Cyrillic script, Old Church Slavonic and Latin. He learned history, political science, and languages useful at court, such as Hungarian and French. Vlad's childhood was far from carefree, but he was afforded some leisure. On feast days, there would be puppet shows in the villages, a tradition in Eastern Europe, with beautifully painted mannequins portraying biblical characters or heroes of classical epics. Vlad likely joined in ball games, hunts in the forests for hares, running and jumping contests, and in wintertime an early form of sledding. By 1436, Vlad's father, Prince Vlad Dracul, had possession of the throne of Wallachia, but he watched warily as Sultan Murad II continued to expand the dominance of the Ottoman Empire. Murad began contemplating the final destruction of the remnant Byzantine Empire. Despite the solemn oaths sworn at Nuremberg in 1431, the Emperor Sigismund seemed far away and distracted. Could he really help Wallachia against Ottoman power? Would he even be willing to do so in the event of an actual Ottoman invasion? When Sigismund died in 1437, Vlad felt that he had no option but to sign an agreement of vassalage with the Ottomans. At Brusa, Vlad made his submission before the Sultan amid much pomp and ceremony, and handed over a tributary payment of 10,000 ducats. How did this square with Vlad's vows as a member of the Order of the Dragon? Vlad had sworn to protect the lives of his fellow Christians, and to some extent, this agreement with the Sultan did allow the prince the ability to do just that. In 1438, when Murad launched an invasion of Transylvania, ravaging and terrorizing the land, the mayor of Sebeş requested that he be allowed to surrender to Prince Vlad, the Sultan's vassal. This was granted, and Vlad was able to secure the lives of the people of Sebeş and prevent them from being carried into slavery. Such were the grim, hard choices that had to be made by the Christian rulers of this region, with the Ottoman powerhouse right upon them. Vlad's vassalage helped shield his own people from the brunt of Ottoman aggression and also gave him some leverage in the terms of the Sultan's conquests. Nevertheless, the Sultan's raids of 1438 were brutal and devastating, resulting in the enslavement of some 70,000 prisoners, all dragged off to lives of bondage within the Ottoman Empire. And yet, in the 1440s, whispers of rebellion began to rise. In Italy, Pope Eugenius IV was calling on the rulers of Christendom to unite in a crusade against the Ottomans. Meanwhile, in Hungary, a new leader had emerged who would ignite the flame of valor and heroism in the darkest of times. His name was John Hunyadi, and his sword would shake the very throne of the seemingly invincible Sultan. John Hunyadi was the son of a lesser Romanian nobleman from Wallachia. He served as a court knight under the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, who was also King of Hungary. While campaigning alongside the emperor against the Hussites in Bohemia, Hunyadi noted the Hussite tactic of deploying armed wagons, which he would later make use of against the Ottomans. The death of the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund in 1437 prompted the Ottoman Sultan Murad II to move to secure Ottoman power in the territory south of the Danube. Murad consolidated his power in Serbia by smashing the fortress of Smederevo and by driving out George Branković, who'd hoped to secure an alliance with the Hungarians. But the Hungarians were dealing with their own internal problems. After Sigismund's death in 1437, Albert of Germany became the first Habsburg to sit on the throne of Hungary. Albert appointed John Hunyadi Ban of Severin and put him in charge of defending the border territories. But King Albert died in 1439, and this triggered civil strife over the question of who would be Hungary's next king. On one side, Elizabeth of Luxembourg, widow of King Albert and daughter of Sigismund, and her infant son. On the other side, Władysław III, aged 15, King of Poland, Lithuania. The Diet of Hungary, the kingdom's assembly of great men, resented Habsburg influence and felt that a child king would be disastrous given the current Ottoman threat. They preferred to invite Władysław to take up the crown. On March 8, 1440, the Hungarian assembly crowned Władysław king of Hungary, but Elizabeth still had her supporters, especially in the north of Hungary, led by Jan Jiskra, the Queen's Bohemian warlord. Elizabeth was in possession of the crown of St. Stephen, and she had her young son crowned at Visegrad. Hunyadi served under the banner of King Władysław and even campaigned against Elizabeth's supporters. Thus, Hungary, and consequently Central and Eastern Europe in general, would face the growing power of the Ottomans in a state of civil war. It was a terribly dangerous situation for the Christians. Also in 1440, Murad II laid siege to the city of Belgrade. But his attack failed, the Christian defenders forcing him to retreat in October. Nevertheless, Murad resumed the aggressive policy against the Hungarians and launched raids across the Danube into Hungary. Resistance to this Ottoman aggression would coalesce around John Hunyadi, who served King Władysław of Poland and Hungary. Hunyadi was charged with defending some 200 miles of southern Hungarian frontier. In 1441, he travelled to Targovište on a mission from King Władysław. There, Hunyadi met with Vlad Dracul, demanding that the Knight of the Order of the Dragon live up to his vows by joining the crusade against the Turks. Hunyadi knew that Hungary needed Wallachian support, and he also knew the pressure Vlad would feel due to his status as a Draconist. Nevertheless, Vlad was a realist. He understood the overwhelming power of the Ottoman position. With Smederevo captured, the Turks controlled the whole line of the Danube, and Turkish garrisons held important Wallachian fortresses such as Giurgiu and Turnu. Also, Vlad wasn't sure he could trust Hunyadi, who he suspected was giving assurances to his rival for the Wallachian throne, the son of Dan II. Thus, Vlad Dracul would offer his polite refusal to John Hunyadi, insisting on maintaining his neutrality. In 1441, Hunyadi defeated the Ottoman Sancak governor of Smederevo. In March of 1442, the Sultan sent an Ottoman army under Mezid Beg to ravage Transylvania. Vlad did not respond, allowing the Ottoman forces free access to Transylvania. Here, the Turks encountered Hunyadi in battle. The Ottomans were annihilated, with Hunyadi slaying the Ottoman commander, Mezid Beg, as well as his son. Murad was enraged and dispatched another army in September, led by the Governor-General of Rumeli, Shehabeddin Pasha, to hunt for Hunyadi. Shehabeddin found his target, but it didn't turn out well for him. Hunyadi's knights engaged the Ottomans in a battle that lasted several hours. Using his war wagons and leading several well-timed cavalry charges, Hunyadi crushed the Ottomans utterly, inflicting yet another devastating humiliation on the Sultan. Ottoman troops were led back as prisoners under Hunyadi's victorious knights. From his pleasure palaces, Murad raged and demanded that his slave soldiers bring him the head of this Christian rebel. For now, Hunyadi's victories didn't diminish the strategic position of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans, but they roused a fire of resistance in the Christians of these regions. Across Serbia, Wallachia, Hungary and Poland, in free territories as well as those under Ottoman rule, word of Hunyadi's triumphs made him the fabled White Knight of Eastern Christendom, leading his cavalry charges in silver armour and promising restored unity and liberation once and for all. But could Hunyadi's early promise ever realise such lofty dreams? Hunyadi hoped that all of Christendom would come to his assistance, but for now, he had only a single papal legate, Cardinal Julian, offering his support and endorsement of the crusade on behalf of the Pope. King Władysław and John Hunyadi gathered the bulk of their forces from Hungary and Poland, with assistance coming from Wallachia later. Serbs, Bulgarians, Bosnians and Albanians also rallied to the banner of the cross. In October of 1443, Władysław, King of Hungary and Poland, along with John Hunyadi, began the first Christian offensive against the Ottomans since the Crusade of Nicopolis in 1396. The Crusader army crossed the Danube and struck deep into Ottoman territory. They captured Niš, inflicting terrible losses on the Turkish garrison, and defeated the Governor-General of Rumeli, who fled to Sofia. The Christians captured Pirot and Sofia, restoring George Branković to his Serbian lands. Fighting through horrible wintry storms, they crossed the frozen Balkan mountain range and reached the Thracian plain beyond. The Ottoman army, which was generally not prepared for winter campaigns, had to be assembled hastily. Murad II only just managed to block the Christian advance at the narrow gorges of the Balkan mountains near Zlatica, which guarded the passage to Edirne, the Ottoman capital. Bitter cold and logistical problems forced Władysław and Hunyadi to withdraw and abandon Pirot and Sofia. Their troops exhausted and near starving, King Władysław and Hunyadi marched triumphantly into Buda, singing Christmas hymns and wielding captured Ottoman banners. The bells of the cathedral rang out, and the Hungarians welcomed their returning heroes with song and joyous shouts. Hunyadi and Władysław led their men before the altar of the cathedral, where they all knelt in prayer, giving thanks to God. The new crusade had struck a powerful blow against the Ottoman enemy. Although King Władysław of Poland and Hungary and John Hunyadi had been forced to withdraw their Crusader army from Ottoman territory, the scale of the success of the Christians forced Sultan Murad II to seek peace terms. Murad concluded a treaty with the envoys of Władysław, Hunyadi and George Branković at Edirne on June 12, 1444. The Sultan effectively renounced his power over Serbia and Wallachia, agreed to release the two blinded sons of Branković, and agreed to pay 100,000 florins to King Władysław. By granting generous terms to Serbia and Wallachia, Murad hoped to break the Christian coalition that currently threatened his European position. The Treaty of Edirne has inspired much debate over the centuries since the Christians were about to break it by launching the Crusade of Varna. On the one hand, the treaty seemed an enormous concession on the part of Murad. However, it also granted the Sultan a critical respite just when the Christians seemed capable of truly resisting his power. In theory, Murad had granted relief to Wallachia and Serbia. But did the treaty in any way lessen the ultimate menace of the Ottoman Empire? Once the threat of Hunyadi and his allies had passed, and the Ottomans had time to rebuild and enhance their military capabilities, what would stop them from simply waltzing back into Serbia and Wallachia and beyond? In that respect, the treaty was most beneficial to Murad, who could neutralize John Hunyadi just when this new Christian hero seemed poised to at last check Ottoman expansion. Such arguments began to fill the courts of the Christian powers. Cardinal Julian, the papal legate, was upset by news of the treaty, insisting that Władysław and Hunyadi had no right to lay aside their duty to fight Murad, who threatened the very heart of Christendom. Julian, in particular, was concerned to bring relief to Constantinople, which Pope Eugenius IV wanted to save from Ottoman conquest. The Pope organized a Western fleet, manned primarily by Venetians, consisting of 23 galleys. This papal fleet arrived in the Dardanelles in July of 1444 and remained immobile on station, with the goal of preventing Sultan Murad from making the crossing. On August 4th, 1444, in Szeged, Hungary, King Władysław and his nobles swore before the papal legate that they would continue with the crusade, despite the Treaty of Edirne. Julian absolved the king from, quote, a rash and sacrilegious oath to the enemies of the Christ. George Branković, who was worried about again losing his lands, refused to contribute a Serbian army to the crusade. This proved the soundness in Murad's original plan with the treaty, which was meant to discourage the Serbs and other Balkan powers from providing help to Hunyadi. But the cardinal was able to recruit a host of Burgundian knights to rally to Władysław's standard. A Wallachian contingent would also join. Murad, meanwhile, felt content to turn his attention entirely to the east, where he began to concentrate on his war in Asia Minor with one of his Muslim rivals, the Emirate of Karaman. However, Murad would soon face a far greater danger in the west. On September 22nd, 1444, a crusading army led by King Władysław of Poland and Hungary and John Hunyadi crossed the Ottoman-Hungarian border. The Grand Vizier, Chandala Halil Pasha, sent an urgent summons to Murad, who hurried to Edirne and proceeded to assemble the Ottoman army. Meanwhile, all of Edirne's able-bodied men were set to work making emergency repairs to the city walls and deepening the moat. Murad advanced rapidly. In October of 1444, he bribed the Genoese to provide his army with safe passage across the Bosporus, north of Constantinople. The captain of the papal fleet, a Venetian called Alvisa Loredan, worried about risking his ships against the Ottomans and decided not to commit his fleet to the upcoming battle, though he could have harried the Ottomans on the Black Sea coast or attempted to join with Władysław and Hunyadi as they advanced from the Danube toward the Bulgarian port of Varna. Loredan chose narrow self-interest over aligning himself with the higher cause. On November 10th, at Varna, without the support of the papal fleet, the Crusaders suddenly found themselves confronting Murad's immense Ottoman host, which outnumbered them by 3-1. Despite being horribly outnumbered, the Crusaders put up a heroic fight. Hunyadi and his knights in particular wreaked havoc on Murad's army. The battle raged all day, and despite the odds in their favor, the Ottomans seemed to never fully gain a clear advantage. In the clash, King Władysław was killed while charging the enemy, dying heroically. Cardinal Julian was slain as well amid the fighting. The Ottoman forces were also heavily mauled, having suffered immense casualties. Nevertheless, the situation was desperate for the now horribly reduced Crusader army. Hunyadi had no choice but to retreat, leaving victory to the Sultan. The Battle of Varna was over, and thus the crusade of King Władysław and John Hunyadi, which began with such promise, came to an unsuccessful end. One Turkish chronicler records the aftermath of the Battle of Varna, saying that the Ottomans
made prisoners only of the fresh-faced youths. All the older captive soldiers were put to the sword.
But the courage and valor of the Christians had greatly tested the Ottoman army, which had only barely achieved victory, even with its considerable numerical advantage. The Sultan's army was exhausted and depleted, but it nevertheless marched triumphant back to Edirne. After his victory at Varna, Murad temporarily retired from active rule in favor of his son, Mehmed. Mehmed, however, was extraordinarily unpopular among much of the Ottoman elite. Mehmed wanted to attack Constantinople immediately, which many of the Ottoman military leadership viewed as rash. Additionally, Mehmed began debasing the empire's silver coinage, which caused a revolt by the Janissaries in 1446. Murad once more returned as active sultan, removing his son from power, an outright humiliation for Mehmed. Relations had always been bad between Murad and Mehmed. Now they were outright poisonous. But Prince Mehmed had no choice but to step aside, as Murad, who was far more popular, returned to the throne. It was just in time too, for the Christians were again rising against Ottoman tyranny. In Albania, a new freedom fighter emerged, George Castriota, son of an Albanian Christian prince. George had been raised at the Ottoman court. He'd even served in the Ottoman military, where he'd earned the title Lord Alexander, or Skanderbeg, but in his heart, he was committed to his people's cause. Throwing up the banner of rebellion, Skanderbeg rallied Albanian patriots to his cause. He reached out to the Hungarian champion John Hunyadi, and the two Christian leaders joined forces in hopes of launching a new campaign against Ottoman power. This was a triumph in itself, for as ever, the Christian rulers of the Balkans found it difficult to agree on a joint policy. Some favoured appeasing the Ottomans, others wanted to fight. It was the example of Skanderbeg and Hunyadi that forged unity out of this uncertainty. By now, Hunyadi was regent of Hungary. In 1448, he obtained a crusade indulgence from Pope Nicholas V for a campaign in Serbia against the Turks. No Western crusaders would join in this effort, but Skanderbeg did, along with a force of Serbs and Bosnians. In the summer, Hunyadi and Skanderbeg marched south, and in September crossed the Danube against Ottoman resistance. Murad commanded Mehmed to move against the Christians, and the prince brought together troops from Anatolia. Mehmed joined with the main Ottoman army at Edirne, and the full Turkish host marched out to confront the Christians. The two sides met at Kosovo in October, the site of a previous battle between Christian and Turk. The Second Battle of Kosovo began with fierce fighting. The Christians displayed much spirit, and the battle is described as a baptism of fire for Mehmed by author Barnaby Rogerson. Mehmed commanded the right wing of the Ottoman army, while Murad commanded from the centre. For 3 days the battle raged, but at last the Ottomans managed to overcome the Christians. Murad's victory at Kosovo meant the end of Serbian independence. John Hunyadi and the military strength of Hungary took a beating and is described by Lord Kinross as crippled for some time to come. Bosnia was absorbed into the Ottoman Empire, but in Albania, Skanderbeg withdrew to his powerful stronghold of Croia, where he settled in for years of bloody guerrilla warfare against the Turkish invaders. Murad strove to subdue the Albanian hero, but to no avail, and Skanderbeg's survival and ability to inflict damage on the Ottoman military was a terrible humiliation for Murad in his final years as Sultan. Around this time, a slave girl of Albanian or Greek Christian origin bore Mehmed a son, the future Bayezid II. But the girl was not considered an appropriate bride for the heir to the Ottoman Empire. In 1449, Murad married Mehmed to Sit Hanum, daughter of a high-ranking Turkoman prince. But Mehmed never cared for her. She bore him no children, and she was neglected at the harem of Edirne. Indeed, no other woman ever played a significant part in the life of Mehmed. In his final years of life, Murad II reconciled to some extent with his son, Mehmed. Mehmed was invited to Edirne, joining his father on a number of campaigns. In 1450, Mehmed collaborated with his father in besieging Croia, the stronghold of the Albanian hero Skanderbeg. An enormous Ottoman army mobilized for this attack, numbering between 100,000 and 400,000 troops. But Skanderbeg was prepared. The Albanian hero left a garrison of 4,000 men to defend the powerful castle of Croia, while he himself maneuvered with his own army in opportunistic attacks behind Ottoman lines. The Ottomans battered the walls, but Skanderbeg employed effective guerrilla tactics, harassing the Ottoman supply columns and spreading terror throughout the Ottoman camp. Skanderbeg led targeted attacks from the mountains, which managed to kill hundreds of Ottoman soldiers at a time. Afterwards, Skanderbeg would vanish with his force into the wilderness, leaving the Ottomans powerless to take revenge. The aging Sultan Murad watched as his army's morale plummeted. After months of this brutal warfare, Murad admitted defeat and retreated to Ottoman territory. The struggle for Croia had been a terrible fiasco for the Ottomans, costing the lives of some 20,000 Ottoman soldiers, while the Albanians lost around 1,000 men. The outcome was a clear and moralizing victory for Albanian resistance. It was a bitter blow to the Sultan in the final days of his life. Murad returned to Edirne. Sometime in the winter of 1451, he fell ill. He died on February 3rd. At the time, Mehmed was at Magnesia. When he heard of his father's death, young Mehmed shed no tears, nor did he feign sorrow. He acted swiftly. He jumped onto a horse and famously cried, "Whoever loves me, let him follow me." He was determined not to be cheated of his father's throne. At the capital, Mehmed went quickly through the traditional ceremonies of coronation. He received the bayat, the personal oath of loyalty from his high-ranking officials. Then, a dervish sheikh ritualistically girded him with the ancestral sword of the Ottoman founder, the raider Osman Gazi. Mehmed had a lot of old scores to settle, but for now, that could wait. He confirmed in their positions many of the men that he feared and hated, the powerful ministers of his father, who'd tormented him since his birth. He also appeased the demands of the Janissaries, whose loyalty was essential for any Ottoman sultan. But within his own family, he would not take any chances. He ordered his infant half-brother strangled to death. The helpless baby might one day be a challenge to Mehmed, and so the new sultan would not allow him to live. This brutal, barbaric act became commonplace in Ottoman succession. Indeed, it was codified into law, allowing the sultan to execute brothers for the good of the empire. Mehmed II decided he needed some major military triumph to solidify his power. For this, he revived his old obsession, the conquest of Constantinople. The Ottomans described Constantinople, the old imperial capital of Byzantium, as the Red Apple, the symbolic heart of ancient world power. Even if the Byzantine Empire was no longer a substantial power in the Mediterranean world, its capital held an enduring mythic appeal, especially to the Ottomans, eager to assert themselves as the great power of their day. Mehmed knew he needed to act quickly. He had many enemies within the Ottoman upper ranks, and while his rule was young, these men would seek out his weaknesses and plot quietly to exploit them. Mehmed also feared another great crusading army emerging from the west to erase recent Ottoman gains. But if Mehmed could subdue Constantinople, he could forever extinguish the plots of his enemies within the Ottoman court, and then safely indulge his appetite for vengeance upon them. Meanwhile, within Constantinople itself, the atmosphere was tense. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI had secured union of his own Orthodox Church to the Roman Catholic Church of the West. There was obvious pragmatism in this union. Constantine's empire had lost the vast bulk of its territories already. If Constantinople were to survive, it needed help from the Catholic kingdoms of Central and Western Europe. Byzantium needed the Pope and the crusades he could summon. But beyond the pragmatism, there were plenty who hoped that this union would effect a true and lasting brotherhood among Christians, in an age when Ottoman violence threatened so much of the larger Christian world. On December 12, 1452, within the magnificent imperial cathedral of Hagia Sophia, the union was formally celebrated. At the true start of his career as Sultan, Mehmed II did not seem particularly formidable. He was short, though built sturdily. His gaze was shrewd and penetrating. He was cold and secretive, and inspired unease among those around him. But perceptive Ottoman courtiers recognized in this young sultan an intense sense of purpose and drive. As Edward Gibbon famously commented, "Peace was on his lips, but war was in his heart." He already intended to conquer Constantinople, but he was slow to reveal his plan. Ambassadors sent to the Ottoman court by the Emperor Constantine XI were met with a friendly reception and an oath to respect Byzantine territory. No sooner had Mehmed made this promise than he expelled the Greeks from Edirne and confiscated their property. Years earlier, at the Bosporus, the Sultan Bayezid had built a castle on the Asiatic side. Now, Mehmed began building a fortress straight across from the Queen of Cities on European Byzantine territory. When the emperor sent envoys to protest this clear violation of Mehmed's oath, the Sultan savagely beheaded the ambassadors. From then on, fear gripped Constantinople. Everyone felt certain that the Turkish wolf would soon devour the old capital of Eastern Rome. Mehmed's new fortress was built on the narrowest point of the Bosporus. The Sultan ordered the dismantling of nearby churches and monasteries to provide building materials for his castle. When it was finished after 4 months, the stronghold cut Constantinople off from the Black Sea. Mehmed named his new castle Boghaz Kesin, meaning cutter of the strait, with the sinister double meaning of cutter of the throat, perhaps fitting given Mehmed's murder of the Greek ambassadors. The Sultan then personally rode with his companions along the mighty walls of the imperial city, assessing the strength of his target's defenses. Constantinople was long famed for its strategic situation. It sat on a wide peninsula, with the Sea of Marmara to the south, the Bosporus Strait to the east, and the Bay of the Golden Horn to the north. Massive double walls studded with watchtowers and defended by a moat protected the landward approach on the west. The Golden Horn itself was protected by a gigantic chain. The waterfront portions of the city were also defended by walls, though not as powerful as the land walls. In the 1450s, Constantinople's walls were around 1,000 years old, but they'd been maintained and bolstered with great care over the centuries and remained formidable. Yet, Mehmed had access to a weapon not previously available to Constantinople's past would-be conquerors: gunpowder. From the beginning, Mehmed intended to defeat the Byzantine capital with cannon. For that, he needed European expertise. By now, word was spreading of Constantinople's impending doom. In 1452, a Hungarian engineer named Urban travelled to the Byzantine capital to offer his services to Emperor Constantine XI. Urban was an expert in the building of large-caliber artillery, and he suggested to the emperor that his guns would be most valuable in defending the Queen of Cities from the Turks. Constantine agreed, but found himself unable to pay Urban's considerable fee, nor could his tiny empire supply the Hungarian with the materials needed for his cannon. Urban was not an idealist. He was looking to make his fortune, and so he travelled to the court of Christendom's enemy, the Sultan Mehmed. There, he offered to build for the Turk the guns needed to bring down the walls of Constantinople. Mehmed showered Urban with wealth and provided his staff with all necessary metals and materials. 3 months later, Urban brought his cannon before the Sultan. Mehmed asked him to start again, but to make the gun twice as large. Urban complied. The European engineer then set to work building an arsenal for the Turk. Urban's gun was truly monstrous. It was 27 feet long and hurled a projectile weighing 1,200 pounds up to a mile. 30 pairs of oxen and a team of 700 men were needed to move such a weapon. At last, Constantinople had met its match. The era of stone-walled cities was about to come to an end. Mehmed was curious about the mood of his people as he prepared for this new war. Disguising himself as an ordinary man, he would stroll through his capital of Edirne, accompanied by only a few soldiers, also in disguise. Mehmed listened to the conversations of ordinary people, assessing their mood and attitudes, especially in regards to the upcoming campaign. If any commoner was unfortunate enough to recognize the Sultan and salute him, Mehmed had the individual stabbed to death instantly. As Patrick Balfour comments, Mehmed's disregard for human life was proverbial. The Grand Vizier, Halil Pasha, like many among Mehmed's court, lived with a nagging mistrust and fear of his master. Halil had been one of the late Sultan Murad's most trusted advisors, but Mehmed hated him, blaming the vizier for his prior depositions during the life of his father. Once, when summoned by the Sultan in the middle of the night, Halil was terrified. He brought with him a dish of gold coins as a gift meant to appease the ruler. When Mehmed saw the dish, he asked, "What is that?" Halil replied that it was common for a servant to bring his master a gift when summoned unexpectedly. Mehmed flung the dish aside. "I want one thing," the Sultan cried, "Constantinople." In early 1453, Constantine XI well understood the approaching disaster. He was a courageous, committed ruler and would stand in defense of his city regardless of the odds. By March, the Sultan Mehmed had assembled an army of some 80,000 soldiers and slaves, including 12,000 elite janissaries. Constantine set to work preparing his people. His secretary Francis was dispatched to determine how many able-bodied men, whether layman or cleric, were available to assist in the defense of the city. Francis' findings were not encouraging. 4,983 Greek men were capable of bearing arms. 2,000 foreign residents, mostly Venetians and Genoans, swore to fight for God and for Christendom, according to the sources. The city's people rejoiced at the arrival of a famous Genoese captain, Giovanni Giustiniani, with his force of 700 skilled soldiers. Constantine named Giustiniani commander-in-chief, and the Genoan set to work with his men, aided by the common people of the city, cleaning the moats and bolstering the defences. Aside from this small force, Constantinople had only its walls and faith in God. Unfortunately, the Christian powers of the West showed little interest in the approaching disaster. Europe's kings were preoccupied with their own concerns. Only 3 ships arrived, sent by the Pope. On April 6th, Mehmed II sent a formal request for Constantine to surrender. The emperor replied with a courageous refusal. The Turk would have to fight for his plunder. On the 11th of April, Urban's guns began pounding at the city walls. So time-consuming was the loading process that the cannons could only be fired 7 times a day. But every time a 1,200-pound cannonball hit the walls, it did incredible damage. On April 21st, a collapsing tower at the Lycus section opened a breach, but the defenders repaired it. The following day, Mehmed ordered his slaves and soldiers to drag some 70 Turkish ships overland to be launched from the Bosporus to the Golden Horn. But the Great Chain prevented the Ottoman ships from breaching the harbour. The Turks then tried digging mines, but a Scottish engineer, John Grant, led efforts to dig countermines, which successfully defeated the Turkish efforts, burying many of Mehmed's miners as they attempted to advance underground. Meanwhile, the the Turks failed to stop the defenders from raining missiles down on Mehmed's men as they desperately struggled to fill in the moat. Toward the end of May, rumours circulated of a Venetian fleet on its way to relieve Constantinople. The notion caused genuine anxiety in the Ottoman ranks, especially among the leadership, and suggests that even the approach of a sizable Western force might have been enough to save Constantinople. But when the Grand Vizier Halil Pasha begged the Sultan to end the campaign, Mehmed would not hear of it. Mehmed wisely understood that the Western powers were too distracted with their own affairs to mount any genuine relief. He addressed the Janissaries, asking their opinion, and the Sultan's slave soldiers declared their support for a renewed attack. Finally, on May 27th, Urban's great cannon opened a huge breach in the wall at the Lycus sector. Mehmed announced that his troops would soon assault the city and be allowed 3 days to freely pillage, ravish, and terrorize the inhabitants of Constantinople. This excited the Ottoman troops. On May 28th, the guns fell silent. Mehmed rode up and down his ranks, urging his men to ready themselves for the final battle. Meanwhile, within the Queen of Cities, Constantine XI prepared his people for the final struggle. The emperor had relics and icons from the great cathedral, Hagia Sophia, carried through the city's streets and along the walls to bless the defenders. Greeks and Latins prayed together, singing the chants of the Mass in unison. Here, in this moment, there was no division between Eastern or Western Christian, only brotherhood in the face of a tyrant. These men would fight together, even if all was lost. At last, Constantine delivered a speech before the city's defenders, gathered together in the Church of St. Sophia. The emperor declared that they should all be ready to die for their common faith and for Christendom, and that he himself would stand on the walls, a sword in his hand, fighting right alongside the ordinary soldiers. He reminded the men that they were fighting the very enemies of God, for Mehmed sought to destroy the true faith and establish a false doctrine in the seat of Christ. May they now show themselves worthy of their ancestors, the ancient heroes of Greece and Rome. Gibbon called this last speech the funeral oration of the Roman Empire. The Church of the Holy Wisdom had stood in Constantinople for 9 centuries, the very spiritual heart of the Byzantine Empire. Now it was filled with its final defenders, Latins as well as Greeks. Gone were the old theological debates, the old bitterness and mutual mistrust. Now here, in this final hour, among these people, the old wound of schism was truly healed. In the face of a brutal conqueror like Mehmed II, things became a lot simpler. Cardinal Isidore of Kiev was present, as well as all the city's Greek bishops. Constantine received communion for the last time, as did all those gathered under his banner. At last, the emperor said a farewell to his family, and then prepared to join his comrades for the final battle. The last man to wear the crown of Constantine in the city of his namesake showed genuine heroism when it really counted. Tuesday, May 29th, 1453, 1:30 a.m. The Ottomans launched their final assault on Constantinople, beginning with blasts from Urban's giant cannons and a clamour of Turkish trumpets and cymbals. The attack came in 3 waves. Obscenely, the Sultan first used the troops of his Christian vassals, sent to tire out the defenders as much as possible. Perhaps Mehmed understood that these men would fight with the least spirit. Next came the Turkish Anatolian divisions. Mehmed urged them on all the while, a mace in his hand, threatening his troops should they show cowardice. At 5 a.m., one of the cannonballs finally destroyed the makeshift defences that had been raised by the Christians in the breach. The Turks shouted, "The city is ours!" and charged wildly toward the gap. But a force of Greeks, led by the Emperor Constantine in person, met their attack. Here, in the most dangerous and exposed portion of the city, stood the emperor, a sword in his grasp. With the walls breached, the emperor would defend the great capital of Eastern Christendom with his body. And defend it he did, hurling back the Anatolians with considerable slaughter. After an hour of hand-to-hand fighting, Mehmed's second wave had made little progress and suffered serious casualties. The Sultan was enraged and decided it was time to deploy his third and final wave, the Janissaries. By now, the Christians had been fighting for hours when fresh Janissaries were unleashed upon them. At dawn, the battle raged, the Christians and their emperor valiantly holding the breach while the Sultan's slave soldiers attacked mercilessly. For some time, the Christians held the invaders back, showing incredible heroism. But theirs was a desperate fight, for they were vastly outnumbered. But as the Christians fought like lions in the face of the Ottoman assault, a small band of several dozen Turkish soldiers discovered a postern door, the Kirke Porta, that was for the moment poorly defended. The Turks burst through and immediately mounted the nearest tower. Here, the Turks unfurled the ominous blood-red banner of the Ottomans. Meanwhile, the commander, Giovanni Giustiniani, was mortally wounded by a cannonball, his breastplate pierced and shrapnel buried in his chest. In agonizing pain, Giovanni ordered his men to carry him away from the walls. Constantine begged him not to fall back, pleading, "Do not abandon me at this moment. The city's salvation depends on you." But Giovanni, who up until now had shown such courage, had lost all heart. His men carried him away from the walls and placed him on his ship in the harbour of the Golden Horn. Seeing Giovanni go down caused many of the Italian defenders to conclude that the Turks had won and to abandon the fight. Meanwhile, the sight of the Turkish flag fluttering over a tower spread confusion among the other defenders, with some wondering if the battle had already been lost. Now, things unravelled quickly. Many defenders abandoned the breach and fled for their lives. A courageous but small number of men stood by the emperor until the end. Among them, his friend, the Spanish warrior Francisco de Toledo, whose ancestors had fought the Moors during the Reconquista, as well as his cousin Theophilus and a soldier called John Dalmata. As the Turks swarmed through the breach, Constantine and these valiant men stood to face them, attacking the attackers with iron valor. The emperor was garbed in imperial purple, the symbol of the emperors of Rome. Few rulers have faced such a catastrophe. Few more still have faced such an apocalyptic scenario with more valor. The emperor stood and fought, even as his empire crumbled around him. With his companions, he went down fighting that day, unyielding to the last. It was this heroic resistance that stood in the face of the tyrant Mehmed, as he unleashed a nightmare of violence and blood on Constantinople. The bodies of the emperor and his companions were never found. Meanwhile, the bishops and priests of the city were saying Mass within the beautiful Basilica of Saint Sophia. Refugees ran sobbing into the church, terrified. Some of the Italians escaped on their ships, but for most of the people left in the city, there was nowhere to run. Thousands crowded into the great cathedral, crying out to God as their only hope. Mehmed's Turks rampaged through the city. They massacred and violated, pillaged and robbed with abandon. Since so many civilians had taken refuge within the great cathedral, the Turks opened a slave market right outside the doors of the church, a vile, despicable act of barbarism. From the high altar, the Ottomans tore down the beautiful great crucifix, placed a janissary cap on the head of Jesus, and carried the sacred object mockingly through the city. "Here is the God of the Christians! Here is the God of the Christians!" For 3 days, the city was looted and terrorized in what amounted to one of history's truly hideous war crimes. The Turks murdered some 4,000 Christian civilians and condemned some 50,000 others to slavery. The name Mehmed the Conqueror will forever be blackened with the horrors he visited upon the capital of Eastern Christendom in 1453.